my name is Ember Kelly, and welcome to this fourth Universalist Society video. I'm the Director of Religious Education here. This video is a recording of an event that took place on February 23rd, 2021. We had an In Conversation gathering where we had a moment to converse with Bruce Pollack-Johnson, one of the writers of the proposed eighth principle in the Unitarian Universalist Association. We had a really great conversation, and I hope that you enjoy getting to watch this event recording. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Ember Kelly, and I'm the Director of Religious Education here at the Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. I'm really excited to have you join us tonight for our In Conversation event with Bruce Pollack-Johnson. We'll introduce him here in just a second. We are going to have for you in the chat a few things. We have the wording of the eighth principle, which we'll be discussing heavily tonight. We also have a podcast that Bruce and I recorded earlier in the month, as well as a video that the Reverend Skylar Vogel, our senior minister, and I uploaded just this last weekend talking about the eighth principle. So just a little bit of extra content if you're interested in engaging with it after the presentation tonight. And I am excited to be with you on Functional Internet because I actually ran into a little technical issues as I was getting this prepared. The internet was out in my part of New Jersey for a good part of the day, and I was a little bit worried that I was going to be doing this all from a phone, but luckily it restored itself at 6:53 with just enough time to get it reset up again. So whether you are joining us in the room or in the future on YouTube in our recordings or on Facebook in our recording, we're just really excited to have you here and really excited for the discussion. In terms of format, obviously we have this introduction moment. We're going to dive into a few questions that Bruce and I have prepared to guide our conversation. And then we're going to allow for ample time for asking some questions. At this point, we're planning that we'll probably have the questions be asked in the chat just to make sure that we're making the most use of our time. And so if you have a question, feel free to leave it in the chat and we'll get to it if we think that it might be something that we can get to in the midst of our conversation. But if not, we'll work on getting to it at the end. And we also do plan that as we transition to that public question time, that we will stop our recording of the dialogue that will go up on Facebook and YouTube, so that way you don't feel worried that anything that you type might be ending up forever in the collection of the internet for all eternity. I know how those worries can be. So Bruce, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
So Bruce, I suppose first, would you like to introduce yourself for our guests who maybe haven't gotten a chance to listen to the podcast yet?
Sure. My name is Bruce Pollack-Johnson. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm cisgendered, white, able-bodied, heterosexual male. I go to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia. Although that name could change in 4 days. We're actually taking a vote. But anyway, we'll probably still call ourselves Restoration for a while since a lot of people know us that way. In terms of, I'm the assistant moderator of our congregation. I'm also a professor of math and statistics at Villanova, and I'm chair of our Justice Council.
And if you guys want to hear more about math activism, which is just an absolutely fascinating topic in my mind, we actually did cover that a little bit in the podcast. It's not one of our set questions tonight, so maybe we'll have some time for it at the end, but it's a very fascinating bit of work that Bruce has been involved in that I enjoyed getting to hear about. So Bruce, our theme this month for education is about confronting white supremacy. How do we do better as religious organizations to organize against white supremacy, to not just say, okay, well, we're not racist, but to be actively anti-racist. In that vein, you've been doing work around a way that UUs can begin to confront some of this complicity in white supremacy. the eighth principle. Could you tell us a little bit about what exactly the eighth principle is?
Sure, and I think this is also in the chat, but I'll have a visual aid that we can work with here. Let me move the... Can you? That's better. So the eighth principle, which I co-wrote with Paula Cole Jones back in 2013, starts just like all the other principles. So it says we covenant and affirm to promote. And then the new part says journeying towards spiritual wholeness by building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And just to show you the more fancy graphics version, this is what's on the website for the eighth principle, which is not maintained very well since it's just a volunteer operation, grassroots operation, but this does look pretty nice. So I want you to see that this would be, if it got adopted by the whole UUA, then it would be like the other principles, we the member congregations of the UUA covenant, etc. So the idea is that the eighth principle is a commitment to hold ourselves accountable to doing the work of undoing systemic racism and other oppressions, not only within ourselves, but in our institutions, our congregations, our wider community, our denomination, if you want to call it denomination, and beyond that. It has been proposed, I don't know how much people know of the history, in the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association in 2017, it was officially entered as a responsive resolution. You might remember that was the year that the president resigned. There was a lot of things going on, and so that seemed like a good time to introduce it. It passed overwhelmingly as a responsive resolution, not as a principle, and that meant that the UUA needed to form what's called an Article 2 commission to look at all of the principles and purposes, including the wording of the eighth principle. That should have happened in 2017. We can get into it more later if you're interested, but the fact is that commission was just formed last summer. It's allowed to have a couple of years to come up with proposals, suggestions for any changes to the principles and purposes. Then after that proposal, there would be the possibility of making amendments as usual at General Assembly, then a first vote. And then if that first vote passes, a second vote at the next General Assembly. And if that also passes, then it would become official as whatever the proposal was, but potentially adding the eighth principle to the other 7 principles, for example.
So we do have the normal, the church bureaucracy.
Yes.
It is a reality that there's lots of voting and committees that will have to happen to make it happen in terms of being an official principle. But congregations have begun to independently adopt it as well.
There's, I just counted, we found another half dozen recently. There's about 40 congregations that some had already passed like a year or two ago that we didn't even know about. So that's certainly a lower bound, as we would say in mathematics, on what the current number. And we know of at least 30 who are planning to vote on whether to adopt it or not in the coming church year, meaning by June of this year. So it could be getting pretty close to 100 by the summer.
It seems a steady pace there, and always good to discover some surprises. So you talked a little bit about the timing of everything that happened at the General Assembly in 2017. In terms of overall, like why now for the eighth principle? Like why does this seem a good time to add something more to the principles?
Well, literally now, or at least this year, I think it's quite obvious that our country has been having an awakening with regard to systemic racism since the murder of George Floyd. And obviously there were many things before that led up to it, but there was certainly a peaking of consciousness throughout the country that certainly makes it extremely timely as a way, something that has existed, but that's a direct response to those concerns, because it's the systemic side of things that we feel needs added focus and commitment that hasn't really happened up to this point. The other piece that I think of is that President Biden and a number of other candidates were talking about systemic racism as part of the campaign. That happened a little bit in 2016, but it was clearly much more strong this time. And even after getting elected, fortunately, he's still talking about it. And so there is that thread of continuity, that there's actually support from the top for this kind of action and movement that we want to take advantage of.
I suppose, one of the common things that I've heard in discussion is, why a new principle? Don't all of the other principles mean the same thing in summary? So why specifically propose an eighth principle versus just maybe adding some wording to the seventh or something, or to the other seven?
It's a good question, and I think a lot of people would agree that in some ways the nature of the eighth principle is implied by the other principles. But that doesn't mean that all UUs have thought that through and realize that that is a natural implication. One of the things that, so the person who co-wrote it with me her name is Paula Cole Jones. She's been active with the Journey Toward Wholeness and anti-racism programs and other social justice programs in the UUA at various levels for a long time as a consultant and regional leader as well. In her consulting, she had noticed a couple different kinds of congregations, one of which she called a seven principles culture and the other a beloved community culture. And the problem was that in the seven principles culture, somebody could feel that they were living by the seven principles, but just be totally oblivious to systemic issues of racism and other kinds of oppression. Obviously, our system makes it very easy for people in the dominant group to be oblivious to those systemic factors. And so we both felt that it was something more was needed than the existing principles to kind of hit people over the head with it, to realize that this is something that certainly is implied, that is consistent with our values and our principles, but needs to be explicitly stated so that we can all get to the same level of awareness. And one way, some people may not know, but the original principles were quite different from what we think of as the seven principles. One of the reasons for that change in the 80s was partly a consciousness related to gender and feminism, but also environmentalism. And those two levels of awareness that had been raised at that point in our history, it was kind of a no-brainer that they needed to be added to the principles as well. And so we feel we're kind of in that same moment when it comes to systemic racism and other kinds of oppressions, that it's reflecting an understanding. Most news broadcasts and magazines these days are writing articles about all this. There's plenty of chances to learn more, but it feels time to acknowledge that as part of who we are and who we want to be.
Well, as you mentioned there a little bit, this is a process I've learned both in conversation with you as well as some other UU leaders, that this is part of the history of the UU. As somebody new to the UU, I think I thought all these seven principles, it's probably something I agreed upon way back when. But when I had some conversation about it, the first I think it was six principles originally, and they were also not only had very gendered language, but they also had very overtly Christian language, which doesn't really reflect the UU in the modern day quite as much as well either. So I mean, this is something that's happened before, that there's been development with these principles. They give us a chance to evolve.
And to me, that's one of the brilliant aspects of UUism, is that it's a dynamic. We can change it as we want. There's not a pope or a leadership group that needs to be making this kind of decision for us. We, from the ground up, and this movement for the eighth principle has been totally two volunteer people working on this for 7-8 years. And now on our monthly Zoom calls, we have often 200 or 300 people, sometimes more than that, interested in working on it, and just it grows on its own momentum.
So, so you said, it allows us to be like on this cutting edge as a denomination. So, many people, as somebody who grew up evangelical, I definitely thought that, the UUs were those, kind of out there social justice-y folks. So, since UU already has like this reputation for being social justice, why do you think it's important, especially for UUs, to acknowledge like our past and our current with dealing with white supremacy, as well as to be more proactive, specifically as UUs? Like, why do you think that's important?
I think we can't rest on our laurels. The challenge is to be that cutting edge group that's on the front lines of social change, and to be leaders in the country and the world for those kinds of levels of awareness and things that need to be changed. And the grassroots aspect and democratic, some people would say, aspect is part of what makes it possible that we, as we become aware, we can make those changes pretty nimbly, as some people would say. We don't have as much in the way of being able to do that as some other religions.
Yeah, definitely. And so, part of the phrasing of this month's educational theme was about like kind of organizing in our confronting of white supremacy. So, as you're saying, this has been a grassroots effort. This not like that someone like called you guys and was like, hey, we really need to like get this passed. We need you to propose it or something. This has been a grassroots organization effort. Do you want to tell us a little bit about like being on the inside of the grassroots organization work that's behind all of this?
Well, it started, I don't know, some people may know about Jubilee training work, anti-racism training workshops, which go from a Friday night to a Sunday afternoon. We were working with a group as we got the idea about doing this, and used that. They decided to meet monthly after the Jubilee to continue supporting each other and looking into what could be done in their own congregations. And they helped us to, refine the wording. And it basically, it wasn't really until it was just kind of in the background, people sharing about it with each other kind of informally for a number of years. But then it was when the crisis happened in the UUA in 2017, when the president had to resign, related to systemic issues of racism and hiring, that it seemed like the time for it to kind of break loose, and had a lot of support at the General Assembly, and it's just kind of fanned out since then.
So we discussed it a little bit in the podcast, that your congregation, currently Restoration, possibly a new name soon, we're the first to formally say, we adopt this as one of our principles. You're the first congregation. What was that work like, trying to like get the congregation on board with thinking about this as like a principle versus just kind of like something that we're about?
Right. So since we wrote it in 2013, I figured, well, we'll see how it flies with a bigger group of people. So our Justice Council talked about it with the board, and then we brought it to the congregation to see what they thought. And we had two pieces. We were thinking of either adopting it for ourselves and possibly endorsing that other congregations also adopt it. And in the conversation, there a couple of things happened. One was the question of why is racism highlighted as opposed to patriarchy or economics, since race came out of economic concerns. And so even though everybody was supportive of the concept, we weren't necessarily ready to act on it as a principle for ourselves, or even for the denomination at that point. But our church had a very strong history during the 60s. Our minister gave a sermon that basically activated people in our neighborhood when realtors were trying to blockbust, meaning scare white families to move to the suburbs as families of color were moving into the neighborhood, and inspired people to form a Mount Airy Neighbors organization, a community organization, with people saying, we want to stay here, we want to be a diverse, integrated community, and we're going to work to make sure that that happens. And it did, in fact, and Mount Airy has been a stable, integrated community ever since that point. So it was very much in our heritage as a congregation to be involved in that work. But it was so new, people just weren't quite ready to elevate it to the level of a principle yet. But they did say, well, let's just put it into our church covenant, because we already had a covenant, and a number of people worked, and basically all of the language of the eighth principle was layered into the covenant just at appropriate points, so it didn't all come together in one cluster. It was spread out over the full length of the covenant, and that was a great solution to me. It showed the commitment that people were feeling, and worked very well. That passed overwhelmingly. Then at that time in 2014, we started, after Ferguson, we started weekly vigils that have continued to this day, where we have both an outside component with people holding signs on the street, and a second part where we light candles and share things related to racial justice issues happening at the moment, including Black history, information that people might not know, and readings from writers of color, sharing music, things like that. So over the years, we built a cadre of people who were very committed to the issue, and when the crisis in the UUA occurred, it felt like the time to say, okay, well, let's just adopt this as a principle for ourselves. And there was no doubt about it. It was overwhelming again, but this time as a principle. And now we print it when we used to print orders of service, we would print the eight principles and just have a little asterisk saying that we have adopted this individually, and it's in process at the UUA, the wider level.
I mean, so you touched on there, you had like this small group of dedicated folks working against it, working for getting things going. And so as someone who's 32 years young, at some points in my life, as someone who's been doing activism for like 10 years of my life, at some points I feel like I'm the grizzled elder. But I can acknowledge that I am still young. But we run into a lot of challenges, and especially in confronting racism and white supremacy in the US. What are some of the challenges that you've run into in trying to confront white supremacy more proactively?
The biggest challenge, I think, is that the nature of white supremacy or any other kind of dominant group is that all the forces in society are working towards your not being aware of those things. That's how they are able to sustain themselves. And so white UUs, for example, have a choice whether they want to act or not. And at any point they can retreat from that and get the benefits of the system as it is. So I think that kind of inertia and the forces being so strongly in that direction is certainly the biggest challenge. And it's really sharing with people, realizing that it's that lack of action that keeps the system in place and is in fact making it worse. It's not just maintaining the status quo, it's actually strengthening those forces in our society. And therefore, the only way to actually make things better is to be able to work on them. And I think you earlier we mentioned about the fact that race is highlighted and not other oppressions, which does not mean that all those oppressions are not important, but as a faith tradition, the Unitarians and the Universalists merged in the early 60s. There've really been only two crises as a denomination that have occurred. One was around 1970 and the other I mentioned already in 2017. Both of those had to do with race. In the earlier time, it was sometimes referred to as the Black empowerment crisis, when there were kind of two sides of how radical to be when empowering Black folk to do things in their own communities and to give money to community groups that were led by Black and brown and other people of color, but especially Black. And it didn't end up happening. We made some commitments that we didn't follow through on. And there had been, in the civil rights period, a lot of people of color who had joined UU congregations, but at the time of that crisis, a lot of them ended up leaving, understandably, that the promise was not fulfilled. And similarly, in 2017, there had been a lot of good work in the 90s, especially the later 90s. Resolutions were passed, excellent anti-racism work was happening, but then it kind of petered out. The focus went elsewhere and the commitment lagged. So in 2017, the end result was this crisis that related to systemic issues related to hiring and people of color and giving preference to white candidates. So really the two major crises we've had relate to race, and we thought that you could say the same thing about the United States. Some people from other religions would say that race is the original sin of the United States, and since we don't believe in sin, we don't say that, but I think a lot of people feel that, understand that idea, and it was baked in from the beginning of the Constitution and a number of the colonies. And so it's a fundamental, since UUism was largely formed at that same time, it's very much baked into who we are and something that we need to examine and correct.
I think that makes well said. I suppose, you know, as someone who's been doing this work for a while, I'm curious if you have maybe pointers for, like, I know a lot of folks deal with burnout, like that they get into this work and they, you know, they log on and they see like, here's 100 things you can do to not be so racist. Or, you know, maybe it becomes a checklist, maybe it, you know, it feels like a chore. How do we handle like that burnout that comes with trying to organize against something that's so strongly embedded in a lot of our institutions?
Well, I think part of the significance of the eighth principle is that it's not only activism, but it's got a spiritual component. It's talking about spiritual wholeness. Essentially, systems like racism divide us within ourselves as well as in society. I mean, people who had, for instance, parents who were racist were deprived of relationships and friendships and possibly more that they might have been able to enjoy if that racism had not been there. So it's not, there is a certain side of being in the dominant, on the dominant side of racism, but there's a cost to it, a personal cost, and that eats away at our souls. And that in order to be doing this work in the most complete way, we want to be thinking about that spiritual side. which I think also, because I think burnout in some ways is doing something without balance and getting too lost in one aspect of important work. And certainly the activism is important, but looking at the spiritual side as well, which is one reason that I think this kind of work being done in a faith community makes sense and is more possible than elsewhere, where there isn't that kind of grounding and nurturing of who we are to help support it.
Well, I mean, and, I suppose part of that's reflected in like the wording choice of, about beloved community, that this is work that not only needs to happen, but that it's work that's done in our communities, that it's not something that, we can, yes, we can all work on it individually, but like this is something that as communities that we have to work to do.
Right. And just to, I don't know how this fits in exactly, but I'll put it out there since there hasn't been an obvious place to put it so far, that there have been a number of people of color that I've spoken with and heard from that had joined UU congregations because of the promise of the principles and the values that we share are very exciting to them, but especially in congregations that are predominantly white, they faced microaggressions, attitudes, things happened that were extremely difficult for them personally. And, some people couldn't take that and just moved on. But if we want to really fulfill the promise of our movement and our values, we need to do something about that to make sure that we're actually living the values that we're talking about. And that's what the eighth principle is all about, really, is making that commitment to do what we can to uncover those things and do something about it, and really be a nurturing place for everyone, not just in the head as a good idea, but as a place that feels at home for anybody.
Definitely.
You were asking about digging deeper.
Yeah. So, I'm curious, like, and I think that relates to like the accountability aspect as well. Like how do we move a little bit deeper than like, okay, I know I'm racist. Like, what do I do next? Which is why accountability is in there.
Right,
exactly. How do we go deeper with all of this?
So one of the things that just came out, as we talked about in the podcast, I think, after the president resigned, there was a commission on institutional change convened to try to understand how we got to that point and what had happened, and make recommendations about what we could do about it. That went on for 3 years. They interviewed thousands of UUs of color and white UUs as well, trying to understand what had happened and putting together there's that book, thank you, Joanna, but there's also a report that they came out with, is a book called Widening the Circle of Concern, that is kind of a compilation of all the work that they did and the conclusions that they came to, broken up into a number of different chapters about theology and governance and community and restoration and reparations and all kinds of different topics that relate to dismantling racism and other kinds of oppressions. And so a very good thing to do as a congregation is just go through some of those chapters, get a group that's interested to help examine what are some of the systems within our congregation that might not be as inclusive as we think we're being, and what might we be able to do to change them, whether it's formal processes or informal processes, because sometimes there's certain procedures on the books, but that's not the way things really happen. And that can be a way that kind of maintains the status quo in a hidden way that can be difficult for other people to navigate. We've just started doing that at Restoration, and it's been fascinating conversation, lots of good ideas.
Well, I suppose to some level it would depend on what happens when if the UUA as a whole were to adopt like But I know that with with the affirming for LGBT issues, I was really surprised to find out that like there's things that have to be fulfilled to like stay on that list, whereas most other denominations that I've been in, it's like, oh, you take a vote once, and like you're pretty much on that list for forever. So like, it seems that the UU does have like a track record of building these accountability tools for like making sure that congregations actually are doing this work if they're saying they're doing this work.
Exactly, and that's a great model, the welcoming congregation. Uh, I don't really understand why, because it seems obvious, and I've thought about it a lot, why we don't have a similar kind of curriculum or program related to race. That certainly is, well, I can't say what's happening at the UUA. I think it was mentioned in the Widening the Circle report. And so I'm hoping that some people will jump on that and come up with a similar way to help raise people's consciousness with a lot of different educational workshops that can help do the same kind of process that we do for welcoming. And frankly, since our church adopted the eighth principle almost 4 years ago now, we just did a trans inclusion workshop over the summer, and we thought of that very much as an eighth principle activity. So even though a lot of the work is related to race, it really, it does mean, and other oppressions, it's just that it would be, for the principles, too long to list them all in that one space. So we made the decision to include the most salient, but acknowledging that there's lots of others there that need to be understood.
Definitely. And you mentioned obviously like the welcoming congregation name there. So you use, we say we're welcome of all, like you're welcome here. How does doing this work around like being the beloved community, living out the eighth principle, how does that make us more truly welcome in your mind?
Well, part of the idea is the eighth principle is really a lens for looking at what you do. It's you can do all the things that you've been used to doing, but when you say, well, how does the eighth principle relate to what we're doing here? Does this square with what we say we've committed to in the eighth principle or not? And so it really is an attitude to how we do things, what we do, always taking that into consideration. And just, for example, things like music and readings and things like that, we tend to, I'm sure everybody has their favorite hymns and songs and special music and things, and it's wonderful when we hear some of those things. But if you come from a different background, different culture, if you never hear the kinds of things that give you that kind of satisfaction, you're probably not going to stick around. And at the same time, it's nice to hear those familiar things. It's also nice to be exposed to other things that give us insight into other cultures and histories. And opening up that space can make a big difference in whether someone decides to stick around or not. Whether voices of color or other kinds of voices of marginalized people from marginalized groups are heard can make a big difference in whether this feels like a place that I belong. The other thing for me, and probably some of you have run across this concept, is the idea of welcoming versus radical hospitality. The main concept being that welcoming isn't just come on and join my club where I've already made up the rules and decided how things are going to be, but come join with us, and at the same time change us, because when someone else comes in, they have something new to give that will change who we are. So it's not just assimilation into an existing reality, it's changing that reality to acknowledge the skills and talents that are brought in, the background, the experience, and to all be more complete because of that.
So as we transition out of our recorded segment and into open questions, so prepare those questions if you have them, folks. How can folks get
chat box, and I
okay? Colin will be our collector of the questions and the sharer with them with us. So Bruce, before we turn off the recorded segment, what ways can people get plugged into this work? Like, I know that there's regular Zoom calls. I know that obviously there's a website that you're showing us. Like, what ways can people get plugged in and learn more?
So certainly for the eighth principle, there's actually a closed Facebook group that one could join for more ongoing updates and timely things that may come up. The Zoom, and probably the simplest way would be for people to get in touch with you, and Paula is actually the one who administers that, but all you need to do is give your name and congregation and email to get put on that list. The main thing is just to make sure that someone confirms they really want to do it. Don't just give names of people who might want to do it, but wait and get confirmation of that from folks. In terms of other things that could be done, that's directly for the eighth principle, but seeing if you can arrange for a Jubilee 3, they call it Jubilee 3 now for the most recent iteration, whether it could be held in your area, but these days there are also Zoom versions happening that people could plug into as a possibility. There's a program called Beloved Conversations that's intended to be a small group ministry program speaking about race and dialoguing about race in a deep kind of way that has been very effective for a lot of congregations. There's an older curriculum that I believe still exists called Building the World We Dream About, that just has a lot of things related to racial justice and history, and including looking at one's own congregation and patterns, power patterns within one's own congregation. So I think those are probably some ways that as a group you would be able to do, and individually people can join in with the Zoom calls, and lots of resources come up and those that you could plug into.
I was definitely jotting a few of those down as you were saying them. So I will make sure to maybe put some names and descriptions. So for anybody who's joining in the future by watching the recording, thank you for joining us. The recording is ending here and we're going to open for our questions.